Good evening on this snowy night and welcome. I'm Pearl Ann Zalarny. I'm a board member of League and also editor of The Voter, our monthly newsletter. My pronouns are she and her. And we're so pleased that you're all able to attend this briefing, which is Leagueese for an informational meeting. And I think that since it's so snowy and cold today, this might be one time when we are quite glad not to have to go out onto the streets to get to our briefing. For our guests, I wanted to let you know that the League is a nonpartisan grassroots organization, and we've worked since the 1930s in Denver and 1920 nationally to improve our systems of government and impact public policies through voter education and advocacy. Our briefings throughout the League year, such as this one, serve to educate our members and voters and often lead to advocacy. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. As you noticed, we are recording, so that you have to click through the recording message. We also use chat during our briefings to ask questions. So we plan to have the questions after the presentation. So I'll be coming back at the end to present those questions to our speakers. The chat also turned out to be a good place for sharing information with each other. So it's also a place where we can truly chat. So we're going, there's some kind of echo.
Rhoda, I think it's feedback. You and your evil twin there were getting feedback.
Okay, mute it.
One of you quit.
And we are also very soon, any moment, are going to mute everyone too, so that we can make sure we can hear our speakers clearly. So I will turn it over now to Sue Stark to talk to us about upcoming briefings, and I will be back with you at the end for questions.
Okay, hi, I'm Sue Stark. I'm the co-chair of the program committee. And our next briefing, we do not have a briefing in December, but our next briefing will be January 17th. And we thought it might be interesting to learn, this is, shortly before the legislative session gets going, but we thought people would be interested in knowing kind of what happens, who monitors legislation that we pass where we raise a tax or we have a mill levy to fund programs, and who monitors those after they get funded, how the money is spent, whether they're meeting their goals, whether they're sticking to what we voted for. And we're focusing on 3 different programs: the Denver preschool program, Caring for Denver, and the legislation that we passed to support developmental and intellectual disabilities, folks with those issues. So we are going to invite someone from the city auditor's office. We cannot invite the auditor because that person is running for office, and we, true to our nonpartisan nature, we would not have anybody that's a candidate for office as one of our primary speakers. Thereafter, we have briefings every month, generally on the 3rd Tuesday of each month. And we are looking at a number of options for other briefing programs. Hope to see you on January 17th. And I pass this on to Jeanette, who I think is going to introduce our speakers.
Right. Okay, welcome everybody. This is an ongoing topic for League. And I want to introduce people that I met at Cafecito when I heard them speak. First is Cecelia Espinosa. And you should know that she has 4 decades of experience in immigration law. She started out in Utah as a first-generation college graduate. She got honors in political science, and she got a law degree from the University of Utah. Over time, she was the 2nd Latina to be admitted to the Utah State Bar in 1982. She must have liked academics, although I've not checked it out with her, because she went on to become a law professor for 10 years at 2 law schools, one at St. Mary's University in Utah, and then the University of Denver here in Denver. But after 10 years of giving advice on lots of parts of immigration and other parts of law, she got called to Washington, D.C. in 2000, and she went to the federal government where she served as the first and subsequently, regrettably, the only Mexican-American on the Federal Board of Immigration Appeals. She was moved to the Office of General Counsel after 3 years. But she was recognized by her own alma mater, the law school at the University of Utah, as a alumna of the year in 2014. And next slide, please. Joy Atahasiou has her own law firm called Joy Strategies, and she provides consulting services to the public and private sectors. Her education was at Metro State University, also in political science, and her law degree was from the University of Denver. She has been working on immigration for at least 15 years, but she has practiced law and in family law and in immigration law. She's been a steadfast advocate of immigration reform by lobbying at all levels. She's also written articles and given lectures on immigration law and policy. Currently, she serves on the City of Denver Immigrant Legal Services Fund Advisory Committee, and she is the chair of its fundraising committee. She also co-chairs the Legislative Advocacy Committee of the American Immigration Lawyers Association for the Colorado chapter. And then last but not least is our DACA student, Nayeli Sanchez, who came to the US at the age of 2. She was born in Guadalajara, Mexico. Currently, she's a 4-year student at Metro State in business management. She, in addition to all her full-time student work, which I never understand how people have time to do anything else, but she does. She participates in the peer mentoring program for Immigration Services Program, which is an academic and social support program for immigrant, DACA, undocumented, and refugee students at MSU, at Metro State. We can have a few words about her from Joy when it's her turn to speak, but until that point, just please welcome our 3 speakers here on our panel tonight. Thank you. Now, give this over to Cecelia, or I think Cecelia will be speaking first. I'm not sure, Joy, if you and Cecelia have worked it out.
We're going to have Cecelia start off, and the only thing that I need to do quickly is switch and put our presentation up, which I am doing now, so everybody can see. Everybody should be able to see our presentation.
So we should take ours down.
I can see it now.
Okay.
Very good. Okay.
Okay.
Well, good evening, everyone. As Jeanette, thank you very much for that nice introduction. And Joy, thank you for working with Natalie and I to put together these slides and to be able to speak and present today. My job is to give a little bit of a history and background. And I know the slide said that we're doing a briefing and update of present day immigration, but really past is prologue. And I think that's why we're going to start with a little bit of history. And I'm going to move through that fairly quickly at a fairly high level. Joy and I got into some weed discussion when we were talking about it today, but I'm definitely going to try to keep it very simple in terms of understanding some of the larger history in the context of immigration law and immigration policy in the United States. So Joy, you can go to the next slide. Oh, you went all the way. We skipped right into the.
Sorry. Here's the understanding our history.
Okay, well, so the next slide actually jumps into 100 years into our United States history. But I always like to start with defining what an immigrant is. An immigrant is any person who leaves their country to come to permanently settle in another country to live. And I think that's important to realize. So we have a lot of individuals besides immigrants who live in the United States and they come in lots of different statuses. But what's important about our history is to understand that immigration for the first, well, from 1600s until 1882, really didn't have any federal legislation. Immigration per se is not spoken of in the Constitution. So there's no declared power of who was going to regulate immigration and immigration to this country. And so initially, the country really was just looking to open itself up and to have a lot of people come to the United States. And I think that's the history of immigration around the world. When countries are starting to get established, they ask people to come, or when they need people from other places to do certain kinds of things, countries have always been open to having people come and fill those needs that existed. So when the country was being established, people saw the Americas as a great place and a land of opportunity to either escape racism or, more importantly, often religious persecution, and to seek economic opportunities. And I think that's the heart of our economic and immigration system, and it always has been. And for those first couple of 100 years, there were no regulations that barred anybody from coming, aside from if they were diseased or sick, they might get turned away because they didn't want to have people coming into that level. And immigration initially was left to the colonies and then ultimately to the states to kind of set some regulations. So that's the background. We can now move to the next slide, Joy. And until 1882. And in 1882, what had happened is we had used Chinese immigrant labor to build out the railroads. And there were a lot of Chinese women that had come and been in prostitution, quite frankly. They had come over either for the men or for the Chinese men or for other men to have access to women in the West. And so there was a sense of anger and animosity towards this group of people, because they were also an immigration group that did not readily assimilate with other immigration groups. And so the first time Congress decides to flex its muscle and say that it was in charge of immigration was in 1882, when they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to try to terminate the ability of the Chinese to continue to come to the United States because their labor was no longer needed. They had built the railroads and they were competing too much with other people on the West Coast and other communities. And so there was a lot of pressure put on Congress to do something about these Chinese who were set apart and separate. So Congress did pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did a couple of things. I think it's important to know that it suspended all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years, and it forbade the Chinese from getting citizenship. And that principle stayed in place until 1943, when after World War, or during World War II, when China was an ally of ours, the Chinese were finally allowed to obtain citizenship again, as the same as any other immigrant group. But there was a long period in our history that the Chinese Exclusion Act established a bar to citizenship for the Chinese. Then in the 1880s, the Congress then codified a lot of the same provisions that had been existing in the states to deny individuals. And so they put restrictions on who could immigrate, and they put bars for idiots, lunatics, convicts, paupers, polygamists, beggars, prostitutes, cheap laborers, anarchists, epileptics, defects, and diseased individuals. So basically, they created a system where people who were seen as other, or who could be defined as being outside the norm, those were individuals who we were trying not to allow into the United States. The 1880 Act, right around the same time as the Chinese Exclusion Act, also put the first head tax on coming into the United States. And so there was a requirement then too, to demonstrate that people had some capacity to pay or to be able to provide for themselves if they did come as immigrants into the country. So the media in the early 1900s portrayed all the immigrants in these negative ways. And that was part of the heart of what was going on in immigration in our country. You can go to the next slide, Julie. So we get to World War II, and we have the interesting thing. There was a question and a poll that was put out in this country, And it sort of goes to show the other and the fear and the closing of minds that we've had in immigration all along. And the poll asked, should we allow German, Austrian, and other mostly Jewish political refugees to the United States? And as you'll see in this poll, over 60%, almost 70% of the population of people who responded to this poll said no. They wanted to keep them out. I mean, some people said, well, they could come if we increase quotas. And some people said, come without raising quotas. But mostly the attitude in this country was to keep them out. Similarly, around the same time, Congress was proposing a law to have 20,000 20,000 Jewish children be admitted into the country to escape what was going on in the war, and especially what we knew, what we suspected was happening. And that law was struck down in large part because of the same attitudes of Americans. So they, again, were polled in January of 1939 to allow 10,000 Jewish children into the United States. And the poll, as again, showed 60% of the population did not believe that was appropriate. So I think this is an example of the attitudes that have existed in immigration across history and across time. Okay, next slide, Joy. So what we had then in 1924, we had what was called the National Origin Quota Act, and that was tagged to the census of 1890, I believe the 1924 Act was tagged to it. So the other thing that was happening is, well, we'd let people in if they looked like us. And that's been another constant theme in immigration. And so the way that the laws were framed to ensure that we were just letting in people that look like us is, we would say who was here as a population as a whole, and then we would tag the number of people that would be admitted based on a percentage of the people who are already here. Though that law favored Western Europeans, excluded all Asians because of the 1882 Act, which had barred Asians, and put a limit on the rest of the world. In 1952, then we codified what is basically today still the framework of immigration, of the Immigration and Nationality Act, but it was amended in 1965. The 1952 Act kept most of the national origin quotas in place and really limited from where in the world people could immigrate to the United States. The 1965 Act attempted to ameliorate some of that national origin discrimination and the racial determination and ethnic exclusion that existed, and created new categories, which these are still in effect today. And Joy's going to talk a little bit about that in the how to immigrate system, by creating 7 categories of individuals that are allowed to come to the United States if they meet the certain criteria. And I will just say, the one thing I've been reviewing my notes and stuff today that I think is interesting and people should know is, always exempt from these quotas have been spouses of US citizens. So that's the one ticket into the United States that has never been taken away. And I think it's important to understand that we at least have some level of family unity. But it's also important to understand that because of these statutes that existed between 1924 and 1965, 70% of all visas were given to those from 3 nations, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany. And that was because they were here first.
And excuse me, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. And now we're going to talk about our system for a few minutes. As you will notice that we stopped talking about our immigration history at 1965, because as Cecelia pointed out, the system that we have today and what we are working with today is that system that was created back in 1952 and 1965. So we've had a few modifications over the years, and we had the amnestia by President Reagan in 1986, and we've had several updates to our immigration restrictions. But we've had very little change in the actual system. So what we're operating with today is what our needs were based on and what our country looked like in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so if you will notice, it's very easy to come to the United States. You just fill out the paperwork. This is you'll see online, and there's been a lot of publicity around this, a few of these different kinds of charts that talk about how to immigrate. And of course, there were legitimate charts put out there for a while, and they just got more complicated. And so now we see a lot of these comedic spin on the chart, but it's pretty darn realistic. All the red boxes are no. You go through this entire long process and you get to no. And you'll see there's just a couple of green boxes after all of these long processes that get to yes. And in reality, of all the people who would like to come to the United States, the vast majority don't qualify and will never qualify. So one of the things we like to talk about is the myths versus the facts of our immigration system. So the first thing is, why don't they just come the legal way? So as we talked about, the way the legal way was created was in the laws of 1952 and the laws of 1965. And it can be basically put into three different categories: coming through family members, coming through employment, or coming under humanitarian. And the largest category by far is our family sponsorship category. And then the employment sponsorship is quite a bit smaller, and the humanitarian is probably close to the employment base, but not quite as large. But one of the things that Cecelia mentioned at the beginning is that we basically group everybody into two categories: immigrants, people who are coming here to live permanently, or non-immigrants, people who are coming just for temporary reasons. So what we're talking about in this first slide is all of the ways to come here permanently. Now, under the family sponsorship, U.S. citizens can sponsor their spouse, their child, their parent, or their sibling. Permanent residents can sponsor their spouse, their minor children, and their unmarried adult children. That's it. Employment sponsorship, as I mentioned before, we have the non-immigrant categories that I'm going to talk about more in a minute, and then we have the immigrant categories. The immigrant categories are very limited, both numerically and as well as the type of industry that a person works in, or their experience and qualifications. So we have very limited ways that individuals can come through employment, and it's very difficult to fit into that little box for most people. And then under humanitarian, everybody hears in the news about asylees and refugees. And then we've heard about TPS. And then there's a lot of other very select groups over the years who have been given humanitarian visas or humanitarian path. One example would be children born in Vietnam to U.S. servicemen. Another example would be individuals who fled the former Soviet Union, Eastern European states. And so the examples could go on, but overall, they're going to be like very tiny groups of people that Congress has given a specific remedy to. And then lastly, victims. Victims would be victims of crime, victims of domestic violence, and victims of trafficking, and those types of victimization. So under the non-immigrant visa categories, these are all the ways that people come temporarily. We kind of call this the alphabet soup, whatever you want to call it. Most people have heard of like foreign students coming. That's our F visa. We also have our temporary worker visa, the largest category, which is H-1B, which is our professional worker, which is in the news a lot. And then we also have under our temporary workers, we have seasonal visas for agriculture and seasonal visas for non-agriculture. Otherwise, nearly all of these categories of workers are going to be professional workers. Then we have like a specific category for diplomats, a specific category for priest and religious workers, and then a few other unusual categories. Now, I mentioned the family-based system. So the other thing that comes into play is if a family member, and this also occurs on the employment side as well, wants to sponsor a relative, it doesn't mean they just fill out the paperwork and the relative gets to come. In most categories, except what we consider to be immediate relatives, and immediate relatives are the U.S. citizen's spouse, parent, or minor child under 21. But all other family members get stuck in line. This is the line. And what that means is Congress only allows a certain number of visas every year. In one category, it's 23,000, just to give you an idea. And because of the very severe limitations on the number of visas, we have decades-long backlogs, particularly from certain countries. As you can see, for Mexico, F1 is the category for unmarried adult children of US citizens. The date that they're processing right now is October of 1998. So for people who can get in line, the line is outrageously long. And then we have the scenario where some people get in line and end up getting kicked out because, for example, they got married, or because their principal immigrant died, or they got a divorce. So some people can get in line, but then they end up getting kicked out of line, or the other group of people can't get in line at all because they have no relative that qualifies under our laws. And then the similar concept works for our business-based immigration. Employment-based visas also are stuck with numbers set forth in 1990. So we have very low numbers. And we have this other rule, this applies for both family and for employment, that no more than 7% of the worldwide number of visas can go to any one country. So certain countries are stuck waiting for decades and decades and decades. So when people talk about why don't they just get in line, or why don't they, or some people jump to the front of the line, basically they have no idea what the line is, and the fact that the line is this screwed up. And another myth that we hear all the time is, well, we can't reward illegal behavior. The other problem that we have is that because the family categories are so limited and the employment categories are so limited, immigrants, US citizens, and employers can't follow the law. There is literally no law to follow. The number one problem in our system today is that we don't have a visa for the workers that we need the most. We don't have a year-round visa for workers without a college degree. So any workers that are in construction, home health aides, housekeepers, year-round agriculture, or dairy, any of your cattle ranches, all of those kinds of workers, there is no visa in the law, and there never has been. And so that's the number one reason why we have such a large undocumented population. Then the visas that we do have in the law are very limited in number and are very outdated. Remember, we talked about the system was built in 1965. So we're looking at and that it's had very little updates since then. So we're looking at a system that doesn't match our current employment needs or our current demographic needs. And we have too many bars and restrictions in the law. As I mentioned earlier.
And Joy, I would just say, that's the only place where you've really seen legislation since 1965 making major changes. There's not been legislation expanding the opportunity for people to come, except through the amnesty provisions of legalization. And a small group of people that can get registry. But other than those two additional methods of getting into the line or getting legal representation, the only thing we've been doing for the last 45 years is restricting who can come into the country. So I'll turn it back to you on that, Joy.
Yes, and I'm just going to tell everybody one example of a restriction. If somebody moved to the United States at the age of 1 and grew up in Colorado, whether they entered legally or illegally, but let's say they grew up in Colorado, they lost their status or never had status. And at the age of 19, if that person returned to their home country for their grandparents' funeral, only left for a week, came back to the US, they are now barred for life from ever getting status. Even if they're the spouse of a US citizen, even if they have US citizen children, even if they've been here for 30 years. That is called the permanent bar, and it's one of the most absurd restrictions in US immigration law, but this is just an example of the kind of restrictions that exist. And the problem is, for a lot of those restrictions, there is simply no way around. There's no waiver, there's no exception, there's no time bar. So individuals can be stuck with something that happened 20, 30, 35 years ago, and they're still barred for life, or they still face that restriction for life. So just another quick myth that I want to hit on, this whole concept, oh, well, they're not sending their best. Study after study after study shows that native-born US citizens commit crimes at much higher rates than either legal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. This was a study based from Texas, so just looking at the state of Texas and the crime rates. But as you can see, the blue line is US citizens. And in this study, the red line is lawful immigrants, which could also be naturalized citizens, the way that they did this study. And then the green line at the bottom is your undocumented immigrants. So there have been multiple studies show that overwhelmingly, it's not the undocumented immigrants that are committing crimes, it's our fellow US citizens. And another myth that I want to hit on is this concept that immigrants are somehow a drain on the economy. Just looking at Colorado numbers, first of all, 1 in 10 Colorado residents is an immigrant, but they have an outsized portion of the labor force. It's actually 1 in 8 numbers of the labor force. And if you look at particular essential industries, like we talked about before, approximately 21% of our construction employees are immigrants, 30% of the housekeeping and janitorial, and the healthcare sector is just off the charts, 29% of our physicians. And now I put 35% of home health aides. The statistics, I looked at a couple of different statistics that all ranged between about 32% and all the way up to 38%. But you think about who's caring for our elderly, and this is the numbers that you're looking at. And then out of all of the immigrants in Colorado, 34% of Colorado immigrants are undocumented. And then at the bottom, you can see some of the economic contributions. And this was a 2018 study, but 1.7 billion in state and local taxes, 4.1 billion in federal income taxes, 15.6 billion in income, and then over 56 billion in housing wealth. So immigrants in Colorado and the nation are contributing. I'm going to go back for a moment because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss one. There we go. So another myth that we deal with day in and day out is this concept of an invasion. And these others are invading, and we can't legalize people that are coming over the border right now. In reality, the discussion about legalization and asking Congress to legalize our undocumented population is talking about our community of 11.5 million undocumented who have lived here for decades. Nearly half entered before the year 2000, and about 85% entered before 2010. So we're talking about a population that has been part of our community, overwhelmingly related to US citizens. If you look at the bottom, 85% of undocumented immigrants have at least one US citizen family member. In the vast majority of cases, you'll see like so many mixed status families. And they are part of our community, they're part of our families, they're part of our churches, they're part of our workforce. And that's who we're talking about when we talk about legalization.
And I would just note, going back to a point Joy made earlier about that example of the individual who, if they leave the country, may get stuck by a bar. Those bars were imposed in the late 1990s, which is at the same time we saw this spike in the undocumented immigrant population, which has stayed relatively steady since that time. And part of it was there were about half of those individuals that would routinely come in and do seasonal jobs and then leave the country and then come back the next year to do seasonal jobs. After the bar existed, that if you were in the country in an undocumented status for 6 months or more, you would be barred for 10 years. And if it was for a year, for life. many individuals then have just been prisoners within the United States because they're afraid to leave because they will never get back to their families.
Yeah, so as Cecelia is pointing out, we used to have a system where workers would come seasonally or would come for a year or two and then go home. And that was the pattern from probably starting in the 60s with the braceros all the way up through probably pretty close to 9/11, because we had the border, the porous border that people could cross back and forth. And then all of a sudden with 9/11 and attitudes towards immigrants, oh, we've got to shut down the border. We've got to fund border security. We've got to keep people out. And that actually had the reverse effect of keeping people in. So those circular migration patterns no longer exist. And then another thing that's really important from this slide is that although all we hear about is the border, about half of undocumented immigrants in the United States entered lawfully on a visa, and then they overstayed. Just like we talked about the impossibility for most people to come to the US lawfully, the other half of that coin is the impossibility for most people who come lawfully to stay lawfully, to extend their status, to change their status, or to become a permanent resident. So again, for the overwhelming majority, there is no path, even if they came lawfully, to be able to stay or become permanent residents and stay in valid status. So now, as we've talked about our history, our US immigration history, and we've talked about our just the framework of our legal system, what we'd like to do right now is let Nayeli talk and give you the perspective of somebody who has been through this system. Nayeli?
Hello all again. Yes, so again, my name is Nayeli Sanchez. I am currently a student at MSU Denver. And I came here when I was 2 years old with my mom and my sister, who is a US citizen. But I was born in Guadalajara, making me a non-US citizen, and coming here undocumented. And so I didn't really find out a lot about my immigration status until really when I was looking into college and seeing where I wanted to go to college, since hearing a lot of my fellow students say that they were going to another state for college and going to these big important universities. And when I started thinking about college, it was kind of like, hey, I want to go to these two. And then coming to the acknowledgement that I can go, but I'd be paying a lot of money to attend these colleges because I wouldn't be receiving financial aid. And so at the time when I started at Metro, they still offered what was called the DIA form, which was the Institution of Financial Aid for undocumented students. And even then, I still had to do much more bigger steps to identify that, hey, I've lived in Colorado for almost 18 years, and my family pays taxes for Colorado and everything like that to qualify to pay that $5,000 in tuition instead of paying $12,000 in tuition, which makes me an out-of-state student. And so really, I found it really hard to come by with not being able to work and help my family financially because I needed that little 9-digit number or my social security number. And it became a really big burden to think about college and me not having to pay for it. So it was really relying a lot on my mom being a single mother. And when we finally had the opportunity and had the chance to talk to an immigration lawyer on options for me and my mom, the option for me ended up being the special immigrant juvenile classification, which is really given to certain children who are subject to abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And so because my mom came with me as a single mother because of issues with my birth dad and other issues in Mexico, it became a very easy process to go by. And so thankfully, there wasn't a whole big whirlwind of this and that. And it was a very straightforward solution, right? And while now I do have my green card and I'm able to go back home and see the place where I was born, it kind of seems like a bit of like switching into a different universe where I've known Colorado and the US as my home for all my life. And so when I finally received my green card, it was kind of a moment of, I won't really believe that I'm able to go back and come back into the US until I finally go and visit Mexico or somewhere else, right? And so another option I would have had if this would have not worked out would have been getting sponsorship from my sister, who is a US citizen. But again, like Cecelia and Joy mentioned, that would have had a whole bunch of worldwide and obstacles really and barriers that I would have to go through. And one would have been leaving the US and going back to Mexico for 20 plus years until some resolution needed to come to place, or if my sister would even be allowed to sponsor me. And so having an outdated immigration system really works a lot with people trying to, one, come in legally, or second, fix their status while they're already here and improving the economy. And so now that I am able to work and I am able to support my immigrant community as well, it seems much more of a reward to see all these new opportunities in higher education that are coming for one, immigrant students, and just the immigrant community. Seems like it's just a bit of a little step forward to fixing this immigration system. And over the past few weeks, when I spoke with Senator Bennett, and one of the main questions that came up was the immigration system, and constantly hearing like the response that we've always gotten, like, yeah, we're fighting to get a resolution going and Immigration Reform Act, and all this was kind of on a pace of being stuck in 1965, like Joy mentioned, of there being no change and no updates. And really, I guess overall what is being asked is just those updates, not to build a whole immigration system that it has kept our borders safe and the US safe. But again, the myths that Cecelia was mentioning, being aware is like the biggest part that I think we've all learned, and staying up to date on like all these changes can help really move the way that these votes are made and taking the word out to more people. But I think on my end, on just sharing out my immigration process is all I have for y'all. Joy, Cecelia, I don't know which one of you is next.
Well, if I could just say a couple things I wanted to tell everybody about Nayeli. I've heard a little rumor that she has been just a terrific advocate for her fellow undocumented students. And she has actually traveled. She has met with legislature, like she was mentioning Senator Bennett. She's been very active at Metro State. She even got to travel last year to Swarthmore College to advocate, to give them the perspective of immigrant students out west, and provide that perspective for undocumented immigrant students. And really just, from what I understand, just really going above and beyond and trying to advocate for your fellow students. So thank you, Nayeli. That is just wonderful.
And
Um,
I guess what I'd like to say is until I heard her story just now, we were under the misimpression that Nayeli was a DACA recipient. And DACA was a specific program established by President Obama in 2008 that has gone through a decade worth of litigation to have it shut down. And someone asked a little bit earlier about political wins, and I think the political wins have been a part of that. DACA was established by President Obama because comprehensive immigration reform couldn't happen. And there was this huge group of children who had come like Nayeli when they were too young to make the decision themselves. And so DACA was provided as a relief for individuals who were in the United States, not of their own choice, who were minors, but who could also demonstrate a certain time period that they had stayed in the United States and that they were free of any of the bars of bad conduct, and they could apply for a DACA status. That is a non-path to any citizenship or status. Fortunately for Nayeli, she got access to a good immigration attorney who figured out that there was another path for her because, as she said, she now has a green card, something that DACA students do not get and do not have access to. They stay in limbo until and unless Congress will actually provide a path for them to have either legal permanent residence or citizenship. So congratulations, Nayeli. I think that that's really amazing that you were able to do that. And I do thank you for sharing your story. But again, it goes to the complications. We believed in a way that she was an undocumented student, and I guess she was to the extent that she didn't have documents when she was 2 years old, but she did not fall into this limbo category. She ended up finding that narrow pathway as a humanitarian ground, because that was one of the other ways Joy mentioned to obtain legal status in the United States.
And just to give everybody an idea, so, DACA recipients are considered part of this overall group of dreamers. Dreamers are all the young people who've grown up in the United States, but weren't born here and have no way of getting status under the law. And just to give you all an idea, the DREAM Act was first introduced in the Senate by Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch in August of 2001. And it was set for a committee hearing on September 12th, 2001.
Oh,
And we all know what happened on September 11th, to sidetrack that, but that's how long that Congress has been talking about trying to pass even just the DREAM Act to help people who grew up in the US and who have no other options. So that brings us to what's happening right now. And of course, what everybody wants to talk about is the border and what's happening at the border. And I wanted to warn everybody, these visuals, these photos may be a little bit disturbing, but these are real photos of what has been happening at our border, off of our coastline, and what people have endured to come through to the United States, and then what our government has done when they get to the United States. And it's been a very, very disturbing and concerning situation that doesn't have a lot of easy answers. It's a far more complex situation than what you hear on the news. And so I'm going to let Cecelia talk about what's really happening at the border.
So, and one of the questions was talking a little bit about the difference between refugees and asylees. And so I put a small answer in the chat, but I'll talk about that a little bit too. But at the border, you have individuals who are seeking entry who have no basis to come to the country. They don't meet the definition of an asylee or a refugee. They're truly coming here solely as an for economic purposes or escaping some other persecution, but that may not qualify for a legal status. So there are clearly some individuals that are just coming to the United States and they're coming in as what would be called an unlawful entrant. But there are also individuals who are coming as asylees and the /refugees. Refugees are actually processed and legally admitted into the United States. So they come in through a port of entry, having a visa been issued to them in order to come to the United States. So they're at the border only and inspected at the border to make sure that they don't have any disqualifying basis, even though they've been through usually 2 or 3 years with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, vetting them, verifying their stories, ensuring that they meet the legal definition of refugee. And then they would come in under a numerical limit that's set annually by the president. Someone asked about political wins playing in immigration. They absolutely do. And in the refugee context, that's demonstrated because in the last administration, the refugee numbers were cut to, I believe, 20,000 was the lowest number, and then they got brought back up again. But the president themselves is the only person that sets that annual number. They get the power to do that. So the political party in power and the political winds that they're facing have a large impact on what that refugee number is. They can and often are influenced by the State Department in terms of hearing what the circumstances around the country are for needing to meet crisis or humanitarian needs for refugees. But we are a small drop in the bucket in the United States compared to the rest of the world in terms of taking in refugees or asylees.
And if
asylees-
I'm sorry, if I could add one thing, Cecelia, with the refugees, it's something that is also very politically decided. So it's the US working with the UN, but also at the beginning, not just saying we're going to set the number, but we're also going to say so many from this region and so many from that region and so many from this region. So a lot of the regions that have legitimate refugee crises are completely left out of the actual refugee system.
Right. And then in contrast, an asylum seeker is anyone who actually makes it to our border or is in the United States under the UN treaty that we signed as the United States. Those individuals have a right to request asylum in the United States if they're fleeing for one of 5 grounds that are the same grounds as a refugee. What is not included in that, and what we're going to have to facing soon, I think, is climate refugees, and then economic refugees has always been the difficulty, in that a lot of times if some country has had a massive problem with an earthquake or something like that, and jobs disappear or things happen, then there are climate refugee or economic refugees, and they do not qualify. So to qualify for asylum, you have to come on race, nationality, religion, oh, come on, Joy.
Particular social group.
And what's the 5th? That's what I was thinking.
Race, nationality, political opinion.
Political opinion, that's the one we were forgetting. So those are the 5 grounds. And if your basis for leaving your country are not primarily motivated by one of those 5 grounds, even if you would otherwise have that as one of the aspects for why you left, the government can deny you asylum status. You also have no ability to, if you come in as an asylum seeker for 1 year, you're barred from work or from any other activities, unless the government adjudicates your application faster than that. And so being an asylum seeker is not a green light. It's one of those other myth-busting things that Joy talked about. It's not a green light to just get you into this country and allow you to have easy access. Other humanitarian basis for coming in, though, and one that Joy hadn't talked about is people can be paroled in for medical purposes. That's a humanitarian need that sometimes we'll do, and we use this term called a parole. And it's not like they're criminals, although that's part of the whole overflow of immigration itself. But a parolee is someone who we put a magic bubble around, and we say they never really entered the country. They're always at the border. We never admit them into the United States in real status. They always have this bubble around them, and so we call them parolees. Other humanitarian individuals could be the TPS individuals. So if there has been a major earthquake in Central America, we've sometimes allowed TPS people, but generally we just apply that status, TPS being temporary protected status, to individuals whose countries experience something and they are here already in an unlawful status. We will put a hold on removing them so that we're not putting more economic pressures on the countries where we would be sending them back to. So again, it's not necessarily for them, it's because of the international need not to make the crisis worse that we'd impose the humanitarian standards. And then again, as Joyce talked about earlier, at the border, there is some trafficking going on, but what's important to understand with this category is it is less than probably 1/2 of 1%. Joy put 1%, but it's definitely probably only less than 1/2 of 1% of individuals who might be actually coming here knowingly or unknowingly to be trafficked in sex or other kinds of adverse criminal activity, drugs or something like that. And sometimes those are people who are victims of what are called coyotes, or people who will be bringing them into the country, and in exchange for that, they will often put them into servitude or some kind of a quid pro quo where they can't, their families are held hostage in their home countries if they don't engage in traffic, in illegal conduct in this country. I will note that my history at the very beginning, when I was doing my research today, that was another basis how we originally brought people people would kidnap children and sell them into servitude, even at the very beginning of our immigration history. So sometimes this stuff comes full circle. And then the other thing to know at the border is there's a difference between apprehensions and individuals who are actually being stopped. Approximately 70% of the arrivals are caught and expelled by CBP, and the total number of apprehensions can include multiple stopping of the same individual, because a lot of times the person who's trying to get into this country without documentation is extremely persistent, and they will do as much as they can. And so there might be multiple times that the same individual will be caught. And so it's not the hordes that you hear by the numbers that you would think, because again, each apprehension is not representative of each person that's trying to come here. It can be multiple people, singular people being stopped multiple times. We don't, though, expel individuals by law who are covered by law, who are children. So we hear a lot about unaccompanied minors, and that was that picture of cages. We've had horrible, it's been a horrible reflection on us as a country, but we don't expel those children. We may take them away from their parents and not be able to reunite them. I think we still have over 100 children that were never reunited after they had been forcibly separated from their parents. And then we don't expel people where the home country won't accept them back. And a good example of that, again, was in Vietnam. For many years, we did not have relationships, political relationships with the country. And so they wouldn't take anybody who, even if they were criminal or other individuals, the home countries have to take them back. And if they don't, then we keep them. Some of those individuals end up in detention forever. And some of those individuals are released back into society after having been apprehended. So it just depends on a lot of complicated factors.
Okay, and one last slide that we're going to show you about the border. This is, and I hope everybody can see this entire slide, but this is a graph of apprehensions from 1970 to 2021. If you look at this graph, you'll see, now there's a couple things that people have to keep in mind. Number one, in March of 2020, CBP changed the way that they count and switched from the old measure of apprehensions to a new measure called encounters. So now the numbers from the last couple of years that sound so terrible are encounters, and encounters includes a few more people than apprehensions did. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. The second thing is that, again, as Cecelia mentioned, this is the number of times somebody is apprehended. It's not the number of people. So everybody talked about our fiscal year 2022 just ended at the end of September. And it's been all over the news that there was a record number of encounters. And the actual number was 2.214 million. But remember, encounters isn't the same as apprehensions, number one. And number two, we also have almost record high recidivism, i.e. the repeat offenders. So when you look at the actual number of unique individuals, they haven't come out with a formal statistic yet, but it'll be somewhere between 1.4 and 1.5 million. So then you compare the unique individuals with these historic apprehensions, and you'll see that what's happening right now at the border is not unusual at all. The other factor that people may have heard recently on the news, it was never a thing until all of a sudden just recently, there's this other term called gotaways. Literally the number of people who got away from CBP and were able to successfully come into the United States. The highest year on record was the year 2000, when we had the 1.692 million apprehensions in 1986. We had an almost identical number in the year 2000. The year 2000 also had 2 million gotaways. So adding those together was about 3.7 million people at the border. This year, we've had 599,000 gotaways. So when you look at about 1.5 million unique individuals, and then you add about 600,000 gotaways, we're around 2 million total. So it's still significantly less than the numbers that we were seeing in the late 80s, all through the 90s and the early 2000s. So when people talk about right now being this historic number of people, it is not a historic number of people. It is just the historic number of encounters. And a big part of that encounters is the repeat crossers. And the other thing that you don't hear is the reason why we have such a high number of repeat crossers right now is because of Title 42. The way that Title 42 works is they quickly return people over the border without any kind of formal process, without sending individuals back to their home country. So the individuals then just keep trying and trying and trying. And even when we had higher recidivism rates in like the early 2000s, right after 9/11 again, that was talking about people maybe trying 2, 3, 4 times. Now we're talking about people trying 5, 10, 12 times to get over the border. So that's what makes the numbers look so high. But in reality, it's something that our Border Patrol has managed for decades. We now have the largest border budget in history. Our immigration enforcement budget is the largest in the world. It's larger than all other federal law enforcement combined. And our CBP, our law enforcement agency, is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States, if not the entire world. So I tell people we already have the Bentley of border security when you look at the entire world. But you hear in Congress, all you hear is, oh, we need more border security. We need more border security. And unfortunately, that's the number one reason. Somebody put in the chat about the inability of Congress to fix the problem. That's the number one reason why we haven't had immigration reform, because it's been just the excuse used by a lot of members of Congress. Well, we can't do anything about reforming our immigration system until we put more money into border security. And that narrative has carried us now for 2 decades, if not longer. So the last thing that this is for Cecelia and I and Nayeli, the last thing that we want to bring to you is just here, what are things that we can do to fix the system?
And this kind of answers the question too, is this an international problem or a congressional problem? And the answer is both. We will be facing international crises as the climate reality hits, and I think there will be forced migration around the world, and other things have caused migration around the world already, either instability within governments, climate, economic, other reasons that people move. And that's an international problem that is not going to be solved by our Congress or what our laws are at all, unless we take a big step back and look at the big picture of how we as a world address those issues. And that's the tip of the iceberg that's not even discussed here. And then there's the flip side of what can Congress actually do? So the first item on this agenda was legalization for long-term undocumented, and that would include our DACA students. It would also include their parents. And as Joy said, since the act was produced 2 decades ago, over two decades ago, think of all of the people that have come under that, and all the people that maybe even aged out of the qualifications, because originally, remember, this is for people who are under a certain age, and not everybody who was originally intended to be part of the Dreamers or the DACA relief would still be by definition included in that. And so that's one of the things that I've worked on in Congress occasionally when I've talked to people, is to say, look, if we're going to do DACA reform, let's take it back to the legalization date of 1986, because you lose a generation between 86 and whenever you finally pass the Dreamer Act of individuals that did come here when they were young and didn't have choices themselves. So legalization for long-term undocumented would do a couple of things. It would provide legal status for all those individuals who are here and for all intents and purposes are United States citizens by every means except for by their birth. And it would also then reduce a lot of pressure on the immigration court system, because all those people would be taken out of the immigration court system and you can actually make a difference.
And it helps us economically as a nation. There have been multiple studies that show that if we legalize our undocumented population, that would help our GDP significantly. It would help our tax base. It would help through contributions. And the numbers are just overwhelming to show that legalizing our undocumented population is going to be a significant net benefit to the United States, not a detriment, as some people would have you believe. And then in terms of I like to call it, instead of comprehensive reform, I like to call it modernization, because that's what we're talking about. So in terms of how do we stop the same problem from happening over and over and over? Well, we've got to create the visas that we need. Remember, we're sitting in a visa system from decades ago. We need, as I mentioned, the year-round visa for non-professional workers. We need an innovation visa or a startup visa. So whoever the next person that invents Google in their basement, there is no way for them to stay lawfully unless we change the law. We also need to increase the numbers of visas that we have and make them more flexible. Right now, they're so inflexible and it's so hard to fit into those little boxes that it leaves a large portion of would-be immigrants out of the equation. And then we have to tackle all of these technical violations and minor violations that end up being life or death for people. A tiny this idea that a tiny violation 30 years ago makes it so that a person can never get lawful status and there's no exception is just ridiculous. And we have to have a system that is flexible to our needs.
I think a good example of that is here in Colorado, we've legalized marijuana use. But if any individual who's undocumented ever touches marijuana or has been related to, worked in the marijuana industry at all, they will be barred from ever seeking legal status. So again, we've got disconnect going on between what is legal and lawful and the realities of how the federal law plays into that.
And in regard to the border, the answer is not throwing more money at the border. That's all we've done for decades. In fact, border, and I don't remember the exact year, but sometime if you count from the late 90s till today, it has increased over 1,000%. Our border enforcement spending, over 1,000%. So we have poured and poured and poured money into the border. That is not a smart way of dealing it. We need to have better border governance. We need to have smart technology, and we also need to really work with other countries and our foreign partners to help reduce the flow of people coming to the US border. We're not going to reduce it through more border security. That doesn't fix it at all. We have to reduce people leaving their home countries. And because of what Cecelia said, whether it's climate change, whether it's violence, whether it's natural disaster, we have to think about the fact that we're all one global world. And another way that the US government has really never had any kind of enforcement or very little is the overstays. If we simply had more accountability for visa overstays, we would go a long way to having a legal system that functions over the long term.
And then the final bullet is one I always ask to be placed in term modernization. And we didn't even get a chance to really talk about this, but this has been my life. And that's the immigration court reform. Currently, immigration courts sit under the Chief Prosecutor of the United States. That is, they serve at the pleasure of the Attorney General of the United States and the Department of Justice. They are not independent adjudicators. They are deemed attorneys that work for and at the pleasure of the Attorney General. So again, going back to the politicization, when you have an Attorney General who is taking their lead from one political side or the other, then that trickles down to the adjudication process in terms of what the priorities are, how cases get adjudicated, and just the type of individuals that get appointed to the judicial bench in the immigration court system. You also have a system where we've been, just like the Border Patrol and border expansion, we have been expanding the number of immigration judges in the actual courtrooms in 64 courts throughout the country and in Guam. But we are not providing additional support for them in terms of support staff to process all the cases that they have. We have a broken technological system that it's supposed to have been working, and it's getting, I guess it's almost getting functional after 25 years of the agency trying to build a system where people can actually do some of their processing online, but it's not very effective and it's not very efficient. In terms of record keeping and technology, the immigration court system is behind all the other courts in the country. And then has a Board of Immigration Appeals that has not been staffed to the same level as the immigration courts. So what you have is a bigger and bigger backlog every year happening in the immigration appellate level that is not allowing for good resolution of immigration cases. And so what you have is people who have legitimately sought relief, maybe been denied at the first instance at the border. They have an immigration judge hearing, and it might take years for them to get that hearing. And then it might take years for them to have an appeal of that hearing, which they have a right to have. And so that doesn't, this is one where justice delayed is justice denied. And I think that the immigration court system needs to be made independent of the executive branch of the government and given status within the judicial branch of government. That's one of my major issues that I think needs to be addressed. And we also need to move the prosecutors, the Department of Homeland Security prosecutors who serve for the chief law enforcement officer of the country, the head of DHS. They need to be the ones that are in the Department of Justice, because really you shouldn't have the judges working for the police, for the prosecutor, and you shouldn't have the prosecutors working for the cops. It's just logical sense in terms of how a judicial system should work. And so those are the critical things I think we need to be addressing to modernize the immigration system.
And someone posted something in the chat about asking us to comment on racism or white nationalism being a significant factor. Just to give everybody an example, there were over 1,000 changes to the immigration system from 2017 to January 6, 2021. Over 1,000 changes. Nearly all of those changes were very much restrictive, very much trying to make the agencies no longer operate, very much basically create dysfunction in the system from within. So we've had over the past, however long it's been now, year and a half, with the Biden administration trying to roll back a lot of those changes, but just the long-term effect of having that record number of changes on the system and the ability for us to work our way out of it is really going to take probably close to a decade. It has still created so much chaos within our government agencies trying to function, trying to process cases effectively, trying to serve the public. It's really not possible to even explain to you the enormity of the negative changes that we saw under the Trump administration. There were also a record number of court cases litigating changes, and the Trump administration lost approximately 80% of their attempted acts on immigration. So their court win-loss record was approximately 80% losing, because so many things were attempted that were actually unlawful. And the worst part is that the administration knew that they were unlawful and were still doing these things regardless. So we had a massive amount of cases tied up in the courts, all on the taxpayer dime, by the way. This is all of our taxes that we're going to fund all of these efforts to basically end our immigration system and to tie up our courts with unnecessary litigation.
And I think all of that goes to the political question. I think the larger question with regard to racism can be demonstrated if you look at the statistical yearbook from the immigration courts, or even from the statistics of the Department of Homeland Security of who gets apprehended and how people are targeted. That has always been an underlying theme within the immigration system, and it bears itself out statistically. That a lot of those overstays happen to be from those same three countries where we issued all the visas to in the early parts of our immigration history. Those individuals tend not to get put into immigration proceedings and often just stay here for decades in that limbo status. They generally don't get targeted at their jobs for being undocumented workers, and they're generally not exploited by their employers for being undocumented workers. But what we see is a whole black market and underground world where, because of racism or because of perceptions of individuals being undocumented or being illegal, even if they're US citizens, that plays out in our immigration system as well. And so I do think that it exists. I think the white nationalism and the fear of the other, that this is just a continuation of our history. We've been doing this since the beginning of our history by virtue of trying to limit anybody who is deemed other. And it's only through time and integration and assimilation that the community and the culture that we want to be built on in terms of immigration being the mosaic, as opposed to a negative situation, emerges. But when any community is infiltrated, the words that are used, by a new group of individuals or new groups of families, there's fear that emerges. And until the communities can come together and understand that there's no reason to fear and that there are long-term economic benefits and other positive things that come to the country when we allow immigrants, we're not going to move forward. So the process is a hard one, and it's one that will require a lot of fortitude from every individual of goodwill, looking at how do we fix a very complicated, complex system and ensure that we do it in an equitable way. So that's the goal. That's why Joy and I do advocacy. She's been doing it in the legislative realm. I worked with the roundtable of former immigration judges. There are over 60 of us who have been writing federal court briefs over the last several years in response to many of the clawbacks of due process that had been afforded to immigrants as a result of some of those changes Joy's been talking about.
So I think we've come to the end of our presentation. I wanted to ask, first of all, Nayeli, if there's anything else that you want to comment on about what we could do to fix the system, or you know, how we can go from here.
No, I think you both summed up, I guess, every aspect that we could try and fix this. So yeah, I appreciate all the information you all just gave.
It was an amazing amount of information. We're all very thankful for it. And you made my job very easy. You answered all the questions as you went along. If anybody has any additional questions, they can put it in the chat. We usually end by asking, is there anything specifically that we as League of Women Voter members can do to move immigration modernization along? Do you have any suggestions on that?
So I'll talk about a little bit of advocacy, and then Nayeli, maybe you can talk about your advocacy a little bit too. So obviously, Congress is the only body in the United States that can fix this problem. And we have this situation where we've had just political inertia for so many years, and several times where we've gotten very, very close, and then just not been able to get enough votes to make it happen. The number one thing that everybody can do is call your congressperson, call your senator, you know, just voice support for immigration reform. One bill that's in Congress right now that I have been an advocate for over a decade, Cecelia referenced the legal provision in her talk. It's called registry. And registry has been in the law since 1929. And the current law is if you entered before January 1st, 1972, you can apply for permanent resident status. So there's a bill in Congress right now. There's a couple of different versions. One is to update that registry date to January 1st, 2011. And then there's a different bill to create a 7-year rolling date. In other words, 7 years ago, and then that would continue rolling forward. But I would encourage everybody to support registry, to call your congressperson, to call your senator, advocate for registry. And then more importantly, if you have family or friends in other states with Republican senators who are, there's a lot of good Republican senators still out there. We need to get them to feel like they have the support to support immigration reform and to support immigration modernization, right? So it's talking to your friends and family members in other states. Both Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Bennett are very much in favor of immigration reform. And so we've got good allies with them, but what we need to do is work and is get people in other states to contact their senators to really push this over. Congresspeople and senators. Of course, just educating people. That's one of the things that we try to do, just educating people about, you know, the fact that so much of what they hear on TV is just a total myth. And it's not the reality at all. And getting involved, there are lots of grassroots organizations that you can volunteer, you can donate money to, you can donate your time to, that are grassroots organizations working on immigration reform. So it's another thing that you can do. And then Nayeli, do you want to talk about a little bit about your advocacy too?
Yeah, I think mine revolves more a lot on the opportunities when I do get to do these advocacy things, like with the panel with senators with Joe Dea and Michael Bennett. Really, that came with an opportunity after speaking at an HSI event. And so really what I focus on when I do these things is people that don't have the opportunity I have right now of actually holding that green card. So actually wanting to get the questions that they want answered onto the table so that the people who are able to make these changes hear what's happening to people who are living this day-to-day life, instead of someone that it's like, yeah, we'll suggest this. So my focus when I advocate for either students at MSU in particular, or just students in general, is really focusing on how we reach that barrier on closing the equity gap on either myths on immigration or the opportunity to achieve a higher education degree. So really the advocacy that I really love doing is, especially like when things do get hard, like the past decision with DACA was partnering up with CERC and holding that the protest outside of the Capitol that same night on the week. And so making sure that I am spreading the word and making sure that on campus or even like on social media, which I'm constantly finding myself more active in particular to help with advocacy, because where else can you find people when it's not through news but social media? And also like making sure that especially like the Hispanic community that doesn't follow a lot of politics is aware of what's happening. So I've been able to talk with local Hispanic news networks like Univision and Telemundo, which has helped bring a lot more awareness in the Hispanic community and help those voters that are able to do it have more knowledge. So that's really where my advocacy part comes into play.
So CERC is the Center for Immigrant. Joy, finish that for me.
Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition.
Okay, so that's one advocacy group that you can partner with through the league. There's also Remain, which is a legal services provider, Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. I was actually one of the predecessor co-founders when I was at the University of Denver Law School campus. We partnered with the American Immigration Lawyer chapter here to help establish what became Remain over 35 years ago. So those are two organizations here that are locally available, and then the Denver Immigrant Rights Group that Joy represents, that works within the advisory capacity, is another group that is locally centered here in Denver that can do advocacy work. So those are three great organizations that are right here that we would encourage you to get involved with, and they're always looking for volunteers to help with needs that they have with the immigrant communities that they're serving.
So I apologize, I missed a question about U.S. employers and the shadow employees, whether they're actually paying taxes on undocumented workers and possibly don't end up paying their workers. Is there any way the undocumented can report these employers?
There is, oh, and I'm trying to think of the name of it. So there are some nonprofit organizations that help employees with wage theft and other types of labor abuses. There's one organization, it's called Towards Justice, and they help people. And I know there's another one too, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now.
And you can also go directly to the state, because the
Mhm.
state labor division will also prosecute individuals, and there you can go to the Attorney General's office as well. They both have hotlines that are available for individuals, no matter what their status are, to ensure that proper wages are being met, because we have laws on ensuring that people who do work are paid for that work. And so those individuals generally are paying that, and they are, and the evidence in the study show that they are also paying those taxes. And so that's where the statistics come from, that there's a huge surplus in the tax amounts, that they cannot claim that money, but they are paying that money in, sometimes under illegal Social Security numbers that they purchased or whatever. But there is a large number of immigrant money that's going to the general fund in the country and in the state on taxes. So yes, to both of those, they are paying taxes, and there is a way, if you're a victim of wage theft, to be able to seek assistance. And sometimes that can even lead to what I have seen in some cases, where if it's a particularly egregious situation, it may put that individual into line as a whistleblower to be eligible for a visa, because they may become a witness in that prosecution against the employer, and that might actually give them a backdoor way to get a status. So there may be a double benefit in that they would get the wages they were entitled to, and if it's a really egregious case, they might become eligible for a witness visa, witness-based visa.
Yeah, and a lot of the statistics that I've seen show that about probably around 75% of undocumented immigrants are W-2 employees. So they get a W-2, they're paying all of the taxes in. So it's a pretty significant majority. And there are people, of course, being paid under the table, but what we see is that will happen maybe for a year or two, that the person is first here, and then they'll end up getting W-2 employment and be paying into our system for years. Somebody had mentioned 9 to 5. I'm not sure if 9 to 5 is doing anything with that, but that would be a good organization. I know that 9 to 5 would know, or other organizations who do, so that might be a good starting point. Any last questions?
I see Kay's hand up. Did you have a question, Kay?
Yes, I do. And it may be, if it's too long, just say, this is something we need to spend more time on somewhere else. But I think both of you, all three of you so much, but Joy and Cecelia talked a little bit about the Latin American community itself. And I think we all know what's happened in the most recent election. And one of the things, having come originally from Texas, is the disturbing things that I think Latinos are being used in Texas without an understanding of what's happening to them. And I'm just wondering what might be either good information books or those kinds of things that all of us who might know Latino people in various communities, or that we might help a league in another state, such as Arizona and so forth, understand these. And if there's books to read or something that you might suggest. That's a long something, but I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about.
So I'm putting into the chat American Immigration Council. They tend to have some good fact sheets and the graph that I had about the 1970 to the present was something that they did. And so they'll put out a lot of good fact sheets and a lot of good kind of countering the myths. And I think the biggest thing is challenging. Even our mainstream media has perpetuated this current invasion mentality, and just challenging that narrative every way that we can. Challenging the narrative that amnesty is a bad thing. We need to, we really need to take the concept back that amnesty is a good thing. That we can act with decency, we can act with compassion, and that's not just being nice, that's also benefiting us. It's benefiting immigrants, and it's benefiting the United States. So really trying to take back this narrative of what has become the Fox News dominating the entire media sphere. And then you even see legitimate publications just parroting some of the propaganda that comes out on Fox News. So just trying to challenge those narratives every way that we can, I think, is really important.
And that's where the work of the league is very important, your nonpartisan work, and when you do it bilingually with your 411, that's a good counter. But what we're seeing also, the irony is, and I think a lot of the Latino community, especially the male Latino community, I say that specifically addressing what we're seeing is this peel off of Latinos towards a far right agenda. It's really coming from a lack of understanding that they're not going to succeed. They're not going to be the people that they're idolizing. And so some of it is this macho notion that they want to be Donald Trump and be that arrogant son of a bitch, excuse my language, but that's that the machismo that's also inherent in what they're doing. And the best counter to that is education. And so the more we can educate their spouses and their children, who will then call them to accountability and say, well, yeah, Dad, but that's great, but here's the reality. We do better economically in X, Y, or Z terms, or this is a lie or misrepresentation. It's the same disinformation that we're trying to fight generally with that against anything. But I think our community has been targeted more explicitly with the notion, and we are vulnerable because of our because we hang on to the American dream. And so we see the possibility of a future that would allow us to be the capitalist at the top of the economic ladder. And so ironically, then that makes people buy into a notion that is counter to their own personal self-interest at this time. And so the more we can educate people, like I think having, for example, if we had information on the tax bill of what it was really going to do to the educational underfunding that we already have in this state, which hopefully with the new provision that we provided, which will actually require truth in those kinds of legislation, then we can get away from some of the things that are pulling people away from truth and misinformation. So I thank the League for the work that you do. I went to your materials to read myself on a couple of the bills where it was kind of like, I'm not sure, let me see what both sides are saying. And the more we can have advocacy like that, the better I think our population as a whole would be. But that also means increasing your membership so that you have more representation and more members who can spread the good word that you're doing out in our communities. So I know it's a task you're working on, but I thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you for the education and for your passion in this area. Jeanette, do you want to close us out tonight?
Can I add one last thing before we close
Sure.
out?
Yeah, of course.
I think everybody can look to Ronald Reagan on this. Ronald Reagan said, I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though sometime back they may have entered illegally. And he had a lot of other good quotes too. And just looking at how we can treat people with compassion, regardless of what side of the political aisle, and forgiveness. We need to bring that sense of compassion and forgiveness back into our political sphere. But that's one of my favorite quotes. So I just wanted to share that.
Jeanette, you're muted.
Okay, thanks for telling me that. I didn't realize it. I think that's really a great quote, Joy, and a good person to give that quote from. I want to thank all three presenters for so much information. I mean, I feel like I'm overwhelmed in a way, but on the other hand, I've gotten the bigger picture. And I like the way you said to break down the myths. So I thank you very, very much for such a wonderful presentation. And I hope other people will tune in to the recording and get the good news too. So thank you, Joy and Cecelia and Nayeli. And I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.